It's indeed my pleasure to be here with you, not just to give a talk, but to speak about something I'm genuinely quite enthusiastic about, and that's maps. My dad had a great map collection, one of the best probably ever put together by a private collector depicting the western part of the United States in Texas. And I started my own collection, but I never bothered to collect maps because, I thought I was going to be an inheritor, right? So why spend money on that? And then in 1966, my dad called and said, JP, I got some news for you. I said, what is it, Dad? He said, I'm divorcing your mom. I said, okay. And he said, and I sold the collection to the University of Texas. Well, I was devastated by that news. So there went the collection, so I realized if I was going to have a map collection, I better go get my own, right? Well, anyway, but I swerved away from that objective just simply because I thought, I could never, it'd be like having a great wife and you lose her and you think, should I marry again kind of thing. I thought I could never put together a collection like my dad, so I chose to focus on other things until over time, as I acquired just sort of entire collections, I realized that I had a fair collection of maps. So I decided to maybe expand that. And because I've always loved maps when I was a child, I used to read the books that I found to be rather dull, rarities, Texas rarities. They're rare, I now concluded, because they were such poor reading, nobody wanted to get them. But in many cases, not always, but sometimes. But anyway, they frequently had maps, and I found those maps fascinating. And so when we decided to celebrate the 200th year anniversary of the Anglo settlement of Texas, we decided to explain it through maps, most especially the maps created specifically to encourage Anglo settlement of Texas, and that would be the maps of Stephen F. Austin. Why did Austin ever end up here anyway? He came at the encouragement of his father, who had lost his fortune in the financial crisis of 1818, 1819. He had started the bank in St. Louis, and it had gone bankrupt during that crisis. And in those days, we say to reinstitute this program, but bankers were liable for the failure of their bank. They had to repay it in effect. So it truly devastated the fortune of the Austins. And so Moses, 200 years ago today, made his way into Behar or San Antonio, met with the then Viceroy Martinez, and got permission, thanks to the help of Bryan de Bastrop, to bring 200 settlers to Texas. And shortly thereafter, probably 6 months or so, he died from exposure to that trip, and it was then left to his son, Stephen, to carry out his father's dreams for bringing Anglo settlers to Texas. Now, interesting to know, and let's look at Stephen here, when he began this effort, he was only 26 years old. Pretty amazing when you reflect on where, well, I don't see anybody in this room, maybe one, that's even close to 26 years of age. So, I mean, to assume responsibility for such a task at that age is kind of overwhelming. But nevertheless, he was fluent in French, wrote for the Picayune paper and acted as an editor for another smaller publication, studied law in Joseph Hawkins' office, and was obviously a very consummate diplomat, and just in his behavior. He'd been raised on the frontier, but well educated back on the East Coast. So I would say he was prepared in part for the task ahead of him. And part of the challenge was going to be the place he was going, because this place we now know as Texas was a vast, unsettled part of the world. And there were only 3 really true settlements within that entire location. That would have been at Behar, Goliad, or La Bahia, as it was called, and Nacogdoches. As a matter of fact, the town of El Paso had not even been formed. There was a church as Isleta, but actually at that time, it was on the other side of the river. And so the challenge was to try to define what the interior of Texas looked like. There had been map makers, cartographers, sort of embroidering around the exterior boundaries. And so there are 2 important efforts to define at least the whole country. And this is Waldseemüller. Now, Waldseemüller was a German and a very competent map maker. And unfortunately, there are 2 editions of his map. And this would be the United States. This would be the Gulf of Mexico. Now, that's interesting, because think about it a second. This is 1507. And the Gulf appears on a map, as does the name America, for the country that we now call the United States. Now, this is interesting because this is Alonzo Pineda's map of the Texas coast, which he was commissioned to do in 1519. And he did a good job of it. The only rivers he named were the Mississippi and the Panuco River in Mexico, which is in the state of Tamaulipas. Those are the only 2 he put names on, but he got the others, he at least recognized close to where they were. Now, you all should understand something interesting, where we can find it on our, cell phones. Longitude and latitude, especially longitude, was a real struggle for navigationists in those days. Matter of fact, the British government gave a 22,000-pound award in 1750 for anybody that could find a way to scientifically define how to locate longitude. And the prize, by the way, still stays out there for great scientific discovery. But so for early map makers, trying to figure out longitude was a real challenge. But anyway, here came Pineda, mapped the coast, and everybody, if you read books about maps, and about maps specifically, those referring to Texas, they will say, and the first credible map or the first map of the coast of Texas was done by Pineda. But that's not true. We know that there was one done 12 years earlier by this German map maker. So where did the information come that allowed him to map the coast of Texas? Well, we can only surmise that about the time that Columbus decided to go sail the ocean blue in 1492, that maybe at that same time or around there, there were Spaniards, maybe even Dutch, that could have been sailing in the Gulf. Now, why would we know nothing about that? Because simply, if you decided to go explore a foreign country, the crown, the king or queen, demanded that you pay whatever you brought back a significant duty. So if you think about the sort of the culture of sailors and so forth, there were guys that were pirates, right? I mean, it's sort of a criminal element. I mean, I'm sure they wouldn't be, if they're going to rob a ship at sea, they wouldn't be offended by not paying the king his due taxes. So I have a strong belief that there were people plying their trade in the Gulf of Mexico long before we thought there were. Now, that brings us to sort of the further examinations of Texas. This is Delisle. Now, I want to point out something to you, how little definition there is in the interior of Texas. We're still focused on the coastline. Now, this was the most credible map that was done of that period by the French. This was driven by La Salle's, obviously, exploration and claiming all of the watershed of the Mississippi River for the King of Spain. Pretty sizable claim, right? But anyway, that sponsored, of course, La Salle's effort to try to settle. He was going to the Mississippi, mouth of the Mississippi, as you all know, got lost in the Matagorda Bay. And by the way, the La Belle, one of their ships, is now on display at the the Bullock Museum in Austin, and it's a well worth the trip to see it. But anyway, this was the French's first effort to develop a credible map that defined Texas. Now, an interesting little sidebar for you, before you leave the museum today, go down on the first floor, the room of discovery. There's a fan there that was owned by a courtesan in the French court back in the 1700s. And that map, just the part of Texas, is depicted on that fan, which is incredible to think of how it would get itself into the court of France in those days. So that's the French's effort. Now let's look at what the English were up to. This was the first sort of what has been called the first modern map, or first modern endeavor to map the coastline of Texas. And it's a beautifully done map and very favored by collectors. And those lines that you see across there, those are shipping lanes for Spanish vessels, who were prominently those. Obviously, this was Spanish territory, so they dominated that effort for the most part. Brits coveted it, of course, but weren't very successful in getting their foothold. But the map itself, in spite of all the definition it seems to present, is terribly erroneous. So if you tried to use this map, you would probably go aground somewhere or get lost and never find where you were destined, you had hoped your destination was. So anyway, beautiful map, first modern definition, but terribly erroneous. So finally, Bernardo de Galvez, who was Viceroy of Northern New Mexico and Texas, but concerned after the American Revolution about the United States' aggression in expanding itself to the Pacific Ocean, most of that land being owned by the Spanish. And by the way, as many of you know who have been through the tours here, that we have a case dedicated to Galvez, who truly is a remarkable individual. He was one of the heroes, truly unsung heroes, unsung not at this museum, but in other places, for his participation in the American Revolution. Took about 7,500 troops up the coast of the Gulf of Mexico and defeated the British at the Battle of Mobile Bay, and then at the seminal battle at Pensacola, Florida, was one of the signatories on the treaty that ended those hostilities, and was the first person to codify cattle brands in Texas. So a remarkably gifted guy. Anyway, he sent Jose de Avila, a navigator, to map Galveston and the Gulf of Mexico. And he did, and Avila named this island in honor of his patron. Okay, now this is the finest portrait ever done of Stephen F. Austin by far. And I can thank my cousin, Stephen Cook, who is hiding behind that mask, but he's now lowered it, and so you can see his face. Stephen is a proud owner of that map. It was, some people have said it was done by Catlin, but I think there are those that take issue with that at this juncture. But it's a wonderful portrait of him. It was, in all likelihood, commissioned by the one person in his life that Stephen F. Austin might have married, and that would have been Mary Austin Holly. There's no doubt that in the chain of affection, it started with, no doubt, with his mother, and then came Texas, and then came Mary Austin Holly, in that order. And but unfortunately, he died before they could consummate that relationship. The last time he saw her, and maybe it was at that moment that she could have suggested to him her intent to get this painting commissioned, was a visit he made in 1836. He went to the United States to raise money for the Texas Revolution. And during that sojourn, he took a detour to go see her in Kentucky and spent the night at her home. And I'm sure it was a very pleasant moment for both of them. And, but that was the last time he was to ever see her. So it is, however, a wonderful portrait. And just thanks, Steve, for letting us have it here today. This is the law under which Austin brought his first colonists. This is the imperial law that had been designed by the Spanish government, which allowed Moses Austin to get his first grant. Now, this was the only grant, Austin's grant, that was done or executed under the Spanish law or under the Spanish proclamation. And all subsequent grants made to other impresarios and also to Austin were under the Mexican law of 1832. So this is a nice document, but it's interesting. The terms actually of the Mexican grants were much more liberal than these under the imperial grant. And Austin was the one that was largely responsible for negotiating the terms in the more generous grants, but he had to stay to the terms. This was been for his first colony. This is a colony that the old 300 obviously settled. But so let's go on to the next slide. So land was cheap, and by comparison, an acre of land in the United States was selling for $1.25 roughly through most of the South, where many of the colonists were going to come from. In Texas, it was 12.5 cents. Now, typical for a husband and wife, they could acquire 4,440 some acres. That was incredible. That was unheard of to most people in the United States, or certainly those in Europe. In Europe, the crown or the government owned everything. Very little private ownership of any land, and that sentiment obviously was followed by the British when the United States was first being, so you had to get your grant from the crown, and only the very wealthiest or the most connected got any land. So land was the best way to, or one of the best ways to define your wealth. So for those coming to Texas, this was the promise of something extraordinarily beneficial. So it obviously became time for Austin to define what this land looked like. I mean, he had to present a map to those colonists that he hoped to bring to this wild, unsettled part of the world, so they would know how to get there and know where they were when they arrived. So that was his challenge. Now, he had some help in trying to design what this map was going to look like. And these are some of the individuals: Philip Nolan, James Wilkerson, Pedro Walker, Jose Puelles, and Jose Picardo. And we're going to see some examples of their work, and the way we're going to present the rest of this show to you will be first to look at those that inspired Austin in his map, or gave him information in which to develop what would be the first really credible map of that part of Texas that he was anxious to settled with his colonists, and much of the rest of the state, or now the state, but then the area called Teos, or Texas. So these are 5 people that played a prominent role. Now the first one, Philip Nolan, was actually not a trained cartographer. He was a horse trader, and actually was commissioned by James Wilkerson. Now Wilkerson, by the way, all these guys were characters. So there's a story about a map. They have maps to tell their own story about the land and whatever is there. These guys have a remarkably colorful story to tell also. So I've tried to bring out some of the details about these characters that I thought would give a little more color to what we're discussing. But anyway, Nolan was certainly a remarkable fellow. He worked for Wilkerson as bookkeeper, but he spent a lot of time in Texas gathering horses, wild horses, that he'd bring back and sell in New Orleans. But Wilkerson, the ever conniving fellow he was, now he and Aaron Burr tried, as you all may know the name Aaron Burr, that may strike a chord with you. The two of them conspired to try to take part of the Mississippi Valley along with Texas and Mexico as a separate nation. Guess who? For themselves. They also served as spies for the Spanish government. And so they lived quite a duplicitous little life. Now, Wilkerson actually turned in Burr. I guess he was worried that he was about to get caught, so he was looking for a free pass. So he turned in Burr. Both of them got charged with treason, and both of them got out of the allegations against them, or the charges against them. And Wilkerson went on to continue to pursue, until his death, an ambition to acquire Texas. And so he had Nolan out there trying to make this map for him. And he did. Nolan created a very credible map of the interior of Texas. Now, unfortunately, even though there is a lot of information about the map itself, people who saw the map or who saw copies of the map and opine on it, I made an effort about 5 years ago. We went to New Orleans, and because there had been a trial of the men who were with Nolan. Nolan was killed by the Spanish right near Waco, Texas, shot in the head. And because they thought he was there for nefarious purposes, not just to gather horses. So all his men were taken to trial. Some of them had to pull the black bean and were shot. Others were released. But that map was, put on evidence that found on Nolan. So he was in the courtroom. So we went to New Orleans to try to find it, couldn't locate it. Streeter, Streeter had the finest collection of Americana anybody ever assembled, period, of Western Americana, and Texas especially. He was an oil man, and his family lost their fortune in Mexico, and he regained it by selling his collection. He tried to sell it to the University of Texas, and they turned him down. They said it wasn't worth it. We weren't showing a great deal of respect for our history in those days, but not that we're doing any better right now in history in general, but in many places. But anyway, it ended up at Yale University. So if you're doing research, primary research on something Western or historical regarding Texas or the West, Yale's the place you'll probably end up. Anyway, so we don't know what happened to Nolan's map. It's just remains a fantasy, and those who are map collectors in this world to get their hands on it. But then there comes our friend here, Pedro Walker. Now, before we get into Father Puelles, this is Pueles's map. Let's talk a little bit about Walker. Walker is, in himself, quite an interesting individual. As you see, he's called, on the little slide we had up there, he's called Juan Pedro, but he actually changed his name. he was born in New Orleans, had an English father and a French mother. His name was John Peter. He had a lot of sympathies for the Spanish. Changed his name, therefore, to Juan Peter. And he also became really a pioneer cartographer. He was well educated for that particular science. His first service was mapping the boundary between Spanish Florida and the United States, and then the country from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean. He did that in the service of the United States Boundary Commission. He caught the attention of one of the most noted cartographers in the world at that time, a fellow named Andrew Ellicott. And he took him under his wing, and he got educated at the Philadelphia Academy, and then began his career as a map maker. And he moved to Nacogdoches in 1806, and then was called, and then moved to Coahuila in Mexico, started making maps along the Rio Grande River, the Big Bend region in that part of the world. And then he got called back to East Texas to try to help settle the boundary dispute that people were concerned might precipitate into a war. He then got caught up, came back to Mexico, got caught up in the whole idea of the Mexican Revolution, was arrested, stripped of his command, and sent to Spain. Unfortunately, he died there. They never did, he was exonerated in the sense that he was never convicted. They didn't have enough to convict him, but they didn't have enough evidence to let him free either. So they made him stay forever in Spain, where unfortunately he died. But there's a very interesting book done about him, which is called The Riddle of Juan Pedro Walker, which is the details of his life as a Spanish citizen. But the writer of the book observes that he was one of the very first scientific map makers, well preceding the work by the United States Corps of Engineers, who started developing scientific maps in this, this last generation. But he did, and we have never been able to see his maps. They have been confined until recently. So at some point we need to do a display of his scientific maps. But he was just another one of these amazing characters that was doing incredible things. Now, as was this guy. This is Jose Puelles. And he was a priest, came to Texas in '79. And until recently, we knew little about his map-making talents. We knew that he had dedicated a lot of his time to map making, but nothing like what we have come to find out recently. He was a brilliantly skilled and very talented individual who properly mapped the boundary between Texas and Louisiana, or Spain in those days, in the United States. And so, an incredibly accomplished guy. His maps have recently been discovered, and so I was shocked by the accuracy of a lot of the interior of Texas. And I know that Austin used Puelles' maps in his map making efforts, and I can see why now, because what I want to do at some point is get us to have a exhibit of Walker's maps, and which are obviously used also by Austin and Puelles and Picardo, who we're going to talk about. But Puelles was amazing in what he was able to talk about, and we'll get into it a little more in a minute. So next. Okay, this is portions. This is 1807 map, and it's the first map to show the capital of Spanish Texas, done by a Frenchman, and obviously a map that influenced Austin also. Next one. This is Pike's map, 1810. Pike was on an expedition to map the area along the Red River and further to the west under the commission of the United States. And he wandered off into Spanish Texas and got arrested and taken to Mexico, where, by the way, he was introduced to our friend Juan Walker. And Walker became his host for his entire stay and then coached him in his map making in Texas. So Pike's map, which is what you see right now, was very much influenced by Walker's efforts in map making also. And this is Humboldt. Now, Humboldt was an amazing map maker, and not only that, also naturalist, and studied all sorts of species, plants, birds, and the entire segment of all of the endeavor in nature and in land and geography and geology and so forth. He's just a genius of a guy. And he did a seminal map of the western part of the United States, and that's a feature of it right there. But what we now know is Humboldt's map was very much influenced by Nolan's work, because Wilkerson sent him a copy of Nolan's map. So we don't know exactly what features. We can pick out some things in there that probably Humboldt had no idea of their existence. So they had to have come from Nolan's map, our horse trading guy. But also, we know that he copied work from Walker too. So both of these early guys, and Walker was using work of Puelles that we talked about. So all three of these guys found their way into Humboldt's map. Very interesting. So this is Picardo. Now, Picardo came after Puelles. There was a big controversy now. We're up to 1804. Louisiana Purchase has taken place, and the United States is claiming that we own all the land to the Rio Grande River. And the Spanish said, oh, no, you don't. You own all the land beginning at the Mississippi River, and we own all the land up to there. So there was a big, so how were they going to prove it? Well, they were going to have to prove it by maps. They would define what the actual boundaries should be from the previous negotiations. So Picardo was given that job. He used all of Puelles' maps to validate the position or their argument that the border between the United States and Texas was the Sabine River and not the Rio Grande. Much to the ire of many people in the United States who thought that we were just giving in to their claims. But Picardo, a very efficient map maker himself, came on the scenes and validated the Spanish claim. And it's there's a good article about it, which truly does validate the argument that that was the proper boundary line, in spite of those who claimed otherwise. So, now this is the interesting guy, Nicholas Ryder. He was a land survey. He was hired by Stephen F. Austin. This is the first time this map has ever been displayed. It's in the University of Texas Briscoe Center. I don't know where they got it. And it was only, I was there looking at some early Austin maps, and I said, do you have anything, that might have incentivized Austin? They said, well, we have some maps that were done about the same period. So here they come out with Ryder's map. He was a surveyor hired by Austin to prepare a map of the country between the Brazos and the Vaca rivers. And what happened is Austin, of course, the Mexican Revolution occurred. He had to go to Mexico City, so he left Ryder there to finish the work. But that's his map, the original map that he made and sent to Stephen F. Austin when he was in Mexico City. So an incredibly historic map. Let's stop here for a minute and talk about Austin and his contributions to cartography. We've seen some of the maps and some of the things, but so it's a good place to say, all right, so what did he do? So let's just discuss that a bit. If you look at Austin, you can say that other than his lifelong performance as a diplomat, one of his single greatest achievements in the settlement of Texas was the creation of the first truly definitive map of this region. And like most tasks in his life, Austin took on the effort with an abundant measure of dedication and diligence. Now, understand something. Map making is complex. It's not like following an outline in a kid's coloring book. It requires the skills of a surveyor, astrological understanding, and the use of a sextant, compass, and telescope, necessary to find latitude by measuring angles to the sun at noon, and longitude by the stars and the moon at night. And it also requires the creativity and imagination to display geological manifestations and sites of importance to an audience of users, which in this case, of course, were Austin's current and future colonists. Now, this task was formidable. Not only was Texas a vast and wild area, it suffered from a paucity of attention from the halls of cartographers. Other than the coastline of Texas, mapped ably by Pineda, whose map we saw in 1519, in Humboldt's famous map of New Spain, 2009, we looked at, which was a magnificent achievement in its depiction of much of the western part of the United States, there was very little done to advance the cause of mapping the interior of Texas. Scholars know, of course, of Nolan's efforts at map making for James Wilkerson, but as we've discussed, we don't know where that map is. However, in 2005, in 1805, 1809, and 10, there were transcript maps which we have looked at that were going to help Austin in his efforts. And as we discussed, the first, Pedro Walker's efforts, he was at that time, as we mentioned, an engineer in the Spanish Army. The map covered, or his mapping covered most of the Spanish Southwest, especially the course of the Colorado River. The second map that was influential on Austin would have been Puellis's map. And Puellis, just for further information, he was stationed for much of his life in Nacogdoches and rendered many inland features of Texas. And properly, he was the first one to properly locate the Brazos River and call it the largest and most important river in the state of Texas. And of course, the other is our friend Friar Ricardo, who labored for years in an effort to determine the boundary between Texas and Louisiana. Now, one thing that we ought to mention about him is the effort he put to map making can only be described as heroic. He worked without interruption for 4 years in a small room in Mexico City to complete a 3,000-page report with 15 maps included. He died shortly after finishing this masterful and Herculean effort on mapping and defining the limits between Texas and Louisiana. Well, Austin's initiation into mapping the path to his colonial domain began on returning from his first trip to Texas. He began by defining the area where his first colony would be established, gaining an appreciation of the rivers that ran throughout, and awareness that there are only 2 settlements within the vast landscape, Behar in La Bahia. What remained was a wilderness, awaiting a map maker, the guide to those anxious to claim it as their home. One benefit of his beginning mapping efforts was an empirical appreciation of the value of expanding his colony's reach to include the fertile lands in the Colorado River watershed. His father's grant had only covered the land around the Brazos River. Austin then left for New Orleans to finalize his plans for colonization, returning in December with a group of individuals. This party included Nicholas Ryder, the surveyor we talked about, who he paid for preparing a map of the country between the Brazos and Lavaca rivers. For his part, Austin did a reconnaissance of the coastline around the Colorado River, only to find that he would have to go up to Mexico to get the government's confirmation of his land grant following the revolution. While his anticipated 3-week stay in Mexico stretched out to a year and a half, Austin had an opportunity to refine his map rendition with helpful additions from Puellis's map and complementary additions from an interesting character by the name of Simon Bourne, a person that book collector Thomas Streeter said we should know more about. It is suggested that Bourne, and now we know more about him. Through research, we can suggest that Bourne may have been the mayor of Nacogdoches, Texas. Now, he was certainly a friend of James Long, the last filibuster in 1820 to try to take Texas from Mexico. And he seemingly also was close friends with the omnipresent James Wilkerson. And he accompanied Wilkerson, no doubt, to Mexico City, where they certainly made an acquaintance with Stephen F. Austin. There was a strong enough connection between the two, Bourne and Austin, that they authored an 1822 map of Texas that resides currently in the Whitty Museum in San Antonio. Let's see a picture of that. This, by the way, this is it right here. This is the first time that this map has ever been on display. It's the combined effort of both Bourne and Austin to draw a credible map of Texas. And you can see they've done a good job on the rivers, especially the Colorado, the Brazos, and the Mississippi, and have begun an effort to define the interior space of that part of the world. Bourne, for his part, published his own map and his observations about his time in Texas and Mexico in a little book called Observations Upon the Mexican Province of Texas. And he describes Texas as the paradise of America. His observations included descriptions of harbors, rivers, climate, soil quality, and he obviously remarked that through all of these observations that the North American government set up the River del Norte, the River Bravo del Norte, Rio Grande, as their boundary, and the persevering intrigues and negotiations to get their pretensions recognized is well known to diplomats. So are so many proofs of the great importance in which this province, of course being Texas, is held by the North America United States. Texas, he said, was distinguished from other Mexican provinces by its many rivers, and he felt the commercial prospects to be very promising. Well, Austin, for his part, distributed copies of his 1922 map with various refinements, including additions contributed in part by colonist Ryder. For the next 5 years after his return from Mexico, he worked intermittently to provide a completed map of Texas. His first edition was presented to Philadelphia map printer Henry Tanner, and the first printing was in 1829. and was met with robust demand for more. Over time, the map went through 6 editions, the last being in 1840, 4 years after Austin's death. By widely disseminating an accurate depiction of Texas at a pivotal time in the history of the region, Austin initiated the modern period of Texas cartography. He deserves recognition for his contribution to the cartography of Texas commensurate with that he received in his efforts at colonization. It could be said that Austin, through his efforts in colonizing and mapping Texas, built the home that was to be the Republic of Texas. But it would be another man's good fortune to be the first to occupy it, Sam Houston. So we have other maps. I'm going to end our discussion here and let you view them as you take your little tour through the gallery. Let me just say, in closing, that when we see the efforts of these map makers and what they created, they obviously set in motion those energies and interest that brought about the final settlement of the United States, the western half of the United States, and demonstrated to the world that the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights could travel to other parts of the world. And it was what those men did and what they achieved that truly stretched the United States from sea to shining sea. It completed manifest destiny, and it made America great. Thank you.